Hi everyone, welcome to the third seminar session from the Mobile People Leverhulme Doctoral Scholarship Program at Queen Mary University of London. Thank you very much for being here today. I'm Manuela, I'm a second year Leverhulme Doctoral student researching deportation policies.
And I'm Nuni, and I'm a first year Leverhulme Doctoral student, and I'm looking at transnational families in the context of South America. And today we're delighted to be here with Dr. Carolina Moulin. Carolina is a professor of international relations in the Federal University of Minas Gerais. And she's also a collaborating professor at the postgraduate program in international relations at PUC Rio de Janeiro. She's the coordinator of the Sérgio Vieira de Mello Chair. Carolina is an expert in critical borders, citizenship studies, and critical IR theories. She's the author of several articles and book chapters, including We Live in a Country of UNHCR, Refugee Protests and Global Political Society, and also Ungrateful Subjects, Refugee Protests and the Logics of Gratitude, published by Routledge. So thank you so much for being here with us today, Carolina.
Thank you, Nuni and Manuela, and hello to everyone and our dear colleagues from Queen Mary.
Thank you so much, Carolina, for being here with us. And although more recently, we know your research is more focused on Venezuelans in Brazil, we would like to start talking with you about your article, two articles actually. One's The Human Rights of the Humans Without Rights, and the other one, We Live in a Country of UNHCR, where although you utilize different case studies, you explore the conceptualization of global political society and strategies of politics of interruption, acts of naming, and acts of retaking, among other relevant themes. So if we could start from one of the main concepts that emerged from these articles, that of global political society, could you explain what do you mean by that, and in which ways do you believe that this concept can be useful to further our understandings of how categorized individuals such as asylum seekers, refugees, migrants more broadly are pushing the boundaries of the so-called status quo by creating possibilities for themselves to be seen as political subjects or even to become political subjects?
So perhaps I should start from where I come from on that research, because my original background was as a lawyer in one of the refugee and asylum seekers program in the city of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And I started studying refugee politics because of that professional experience. And one of the things that really disturbed me in thinking about public policies and political theory discussions as well, you know, the junction between theory and practice, was precisely the inability when we think about asylum policies and refugees and migrants, and I'm talking about those categories in very flexible, hybrid ways, was to take citizenship as our starting point. So the work of Anginizing has been one of the most important, very inspirational for me throughout my academic journey. The idea that we need to think citizenship as a set of practices instead of as a formal, legal, governmental category. But in a way, I think the challenge for us looking at migration and refugee politics from the South, and then again, I know how those categories are politically complicated, but if we look from the experience, right, from a city like Rio, which is marked by important racial, gender, economic, material, social inequalities, it's very hard to think citizenship as the platform for rights claiming, for negotiating with governmental agencies, and so on and so forth. So at that point, I was working with my supervisor, Peter Niersch, at McMaster University in Canada. And Peter was very interested in ideas of irregularity, challenges to practices of citizenship, especially from the Canadian perspective. And I was looking at it from the perspective of, you know, that the messy Brazilian environment in the early 2000s. There was increasing discussions about the need to change migration law. We had just passed a new refugee law in the late 90s. So it was really a booming period for thinking public policies in relation to migrants and asylum seekers and refugees. But again, the problem was thinking about that without the framework of citizenship, or twisting citizenship as a normative ideal in contexts in which citizenship was never, right, a fulfilled. I don't think it has ever been a fulfilled normative category, even in developed societies. But for us, it was even more challenging. So we build on the concept of political society, which is based on Partha Chatterjee's, this important post-colonial, decolonial scholar, who looked at the experience of India. That has many, I think, differences, but also highlights some important connections with experiences of intensive urbanization and the consequences of intensive urbanization on precarious lives. Let's put it that way, right? And we thought it was a really important concept to highlight the tensions, ambivalences in relationships between those groups that arrived in contexts of increasing precarity, different levels of violence, a whole new set of discriminations. And had to engage with communities that are, you know, that were facing material, social, economic, I mean, all sorts of difficulties. And they had to begin a new life in context of enormous precarity as well. So we use that concept in a way to circumvent the idea of civil society. The debate on migration here was mainly driven by civil society organizations, but at the same time, most of those civil society organizations were more like mediators rather than spokespeople, or were really engaged in self-organizing refugees. So there was a strong difficulties in terms of thinking about those groups as political subjects, as autonomous political subjects. And we thought the idea of political society really shed light into the possibility of thinking, you know, how we can recognize those groups as agents in the process of discussing who they are, what they want, what sorts of policies we should be discussing, implementing for and with them. But at the same time, bringing that, because Chatterjee looks at that from a national, local perspective. And when we look at migration and mobile people, right, we're increasingly looking at structures of governance, at categories, at normative types, at ideals of integration and solutions that are profoundly global in a way, but that also travel and get translated in very heterogeneous and complicated, complex forms. So the idea to develop the concept of globalizing, in a way, political society was a way of moving away from the straitjacket of ideas of civility, citizenship, as a preconceived kind of universal category, and trying to look at the difficulties, the complexities, the negotiations, the ambivalence, right? Because in a way, I think the refugee category is a profoundly ambivalent category. Because in a way, when you talk to refugee communities, they want the protection, but they also refuse many of the characteristics that are usually associated with that identity. So it's a very ambivalent, complicated relationship. And it gets even more complicated in context of, I think, precarious urbanization, where you have, you know, this mix of governmental local, provincial, national, international, that get, you know, NGOs, all sorts of things that get mixed in the everyday life of these subjects. And it's very, they become very illegible for them in terms of who is responsible for what, who speaks for whom. And that gets very messy in the everyday disputes about resources, about voice, about political agency, and so on and so forth. So in a nutshell, I think the inspiration comes from attempts to think about conceptual tools that might help us understand complex, heterogeneous experiences of living in context of mobility, especially in, I would say, developing countries or global south countries, which are nowadays, right, the majority of countries and societies who have to deal with mobile people in context of precarity.
Yeah, you already touched upon all other themes we wanted to ask you. And so just to I think, continue from your answer. So, because you mentioned there is this difference, a slight difference between the civil society and the political society. And then when you explain the political society in your articles, you also mention acts of interruption, renaming, retaking. So I wonder if you could expand a little bit about these strategies.
So I think one of the things that's one of the biggest challenges for us as theorists, scholars, advocacy professionals, right, in the field of mobility, is to think, how can we think about political agency for and with those subjects, right? Because most of our framework is geared towards organizing, legitimizing, making things formal, somewhat modulating, mimicking what governmental state structures tell us is the right form of political engagement. And this has been, I think, a general problem of modernity, right? The fact that states have become, in modernity, the main form of organization of community and political life has also meant that this is the paradigm against which we should think politically, right? And I think recent decades have posed the problem that alternative forms of political engagement have become not only increasingly invisibilized. I don't know if we say that in English, right? They have been invisible, but also they have been made criminal, right? So you study deportation policies. I mean, all the ways in which states and forms, I'm not going to say states, but maybe statist forms of governing populations have turned many forms of political organization as violent responses, as criminal responses, as out of law, right? So this idea that there is order and disorder is much centered around law as a language of the state, right? And law that produces others as illegal, irregulars, non-compliance, and so on and so forth. So one of the things that we struggle with is to think about, again, political agency for those, and what sorts of ways in which those groups engage politically with different structures that they need to mobilize in order to survive, in order to retake their lives, and so on and so forth. So we have, as many scholars around the world, engaged with these multiple forms and trying to make them visible, right, in terms of our research. So one way this happens is through, obviously, protests, manifestations, sit-ins, camps, right? Those are traditional forms of making demands upon different groups. But there are also, I think, other ways in which we can interpret, right? We can think about frameworks of reading and making those experiences relevant for rethinking what we understand as political community, legitimate forms of intervening in political debates, right? Making some groups heard and relevant in defining their own destinies. So we've been very focused during those two research periods in which those papers were produced, in looking at those experiences. So one of the ways was precisely thinking about interruption as a mechanism of forcing, right, the public debate to pay attention, to reframe the questions, to redefine the agenda, resignifying what being a refugee is, what an asylum seeker is. In the context of the Sudanese protests in Cairo, this was a major, of course, the consequences back in 2005 were extremely violent, because the sit-in was, the police came in and they violently disbanded the group. They killed some of the protesters, right? But one of the biggest consequences of that protest was to force those agencies to rethink what their urban refugee policy was, right? So in a way, I would say that the 2009 UNHCR urban refugee policy is a direct consequence of the interruption that the Sudanese protesters in Cairo created. So this is one way in which we can think about how political agency moves, connects, intervenes, right, and reframes in a way the political debate. Another way is that I have during fieldwork research in border areas in South America, was to think about rumors as mechanisms of creating a sense of political community that is safe for that community, because I mean, rumors start, but you don't know where they begin, right? Do rumors, as and the anthropologist that I really like state, it's rumors are unsigned in a way, because they have a life of their own, but at the same time they're able to create, you know, and create a structured social environment in which perceptions about who the actors are, so ideas about when we can claim rights, to whom we should talk to, who are allies, who are enemies, right? So communities kind of construct their own collective perceptions through unsigned forms of communication that I think are really relevant for understanding the limits of what we frame as political communities nowadays, especially in our current context, right, in which our experiences of life are so fragmented. I mean, we inhabit multiple spaces, we engage with multiple communities simultaneously. And this is the same thing for mobile peoples, right? They have to negotiate these multiple communities simultaneously. So how do we understand our different modes of being in the world without being trapped by statist understandings of what politics is?
I was just thinking about one final question regarding this theme, that in also one of the articles you mentioned the ambiguity, that at the same time they are interrupting, renaming, retaking. They're also, as you mentioned in the, for example, the protests in Cairo, they were saying they were refugees, but some of them were not, or they were not. And so I was wondering if you also could just perhaps finalize this theme by talking to us a little bit about this ambiguity, that at the same time, mobile people are protesting this state categories. They're also using them for their own benefit in a way. So, yeah.
In a later research we did with Haitians, Haitians traveling through South America, we developed that idea through Michel de Certeau's difference between tactics and this idea that it's possible to tactically appropriate, right, governmental categories. That refugees, different types of migrants, I mean, if we think about the legal framework, it's a strategic way of organizing mobility, right? De Certeau gives this example of, the grid, the map of a city, right? You construct the grid, and then it's the architecture in which you should, through which you should walk, drive, and move throughout the city. So in a way, when we think about the global governance and how that travels to national, local spaces, or the transnational spaces of governing mobility, those are thought through, when I talk about statist categories, through strategic, let's say, frameworks, right? And if we look at that from the perspective of autonomous migrants, of autonomous mobility, then we will see that they constantly tactically appropriate those categories, right? It's not that I don't want to be a refugee, that I don't want to have a regular, residency permit. But I tactically appropriate that through my mobility project, right? And it changes. The mobility projects change throughout life, right? So I think the central idea here is to think through flexible spatial temporal categories that allow us to read and interpret those changing environments, right? Those changing social contexts. And I think that the idea of tactical mobility is an interesting one. I mean, there's a large literature on autonomy of migration that has been very influential in responding to those challenges. It has been criticized as well. But I think it does point to the importance of recentering research, recentering our conceptual development, recentering our empirical concerns to mobile subjects, to mobile people, which I think is the spirit as well of your interventions, right? So I'm not sure I responded to your question.
You did. I don't know if Nuni would like to take over for the next round.
Yes, thank you so much, Carolina. I think that's actually I think both of us would love really reading your texts and your articles. And one of the things that really caught my attention, and it has a lot to do with what you were talking about, the global political society, is how you, like, by drawing on empirical studies of South-South mobility, how we can make, like, really insightful theoretical contributions. And one of the things that really called my attention in your work is this idea of mobility through zones of marginality, right? Which is something that you already mentioned before as well. And so I think it was very interesting how, like, you use this, for example, the case of Congolese living in the slums in Rio de Janeiro, and also Colombians moving to this northern border of Brazil, and Sudanese in Cairo. And you say how these populations, when they at these host countries, they do not necessarily feel more secure, right, than they did before. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about this idea of, like, mobility through zones of marginality, and how you think that challenges our traditional concepts of protection, more specifically.
I think that's the theme of my life. I don't have a full-fledged answer for you, but I really think that we did some extensive I wouldn't say extensive, but we did some intensive research in slum areas in Rio, looking at the ways in which protection, right? Yeah, and not only for refugees, but humanitarian protection in general would travel to global South urban areas. And one of the things that we found was precisely that, and this is interesting because it hasn't anything to do precisely with mobility, but it travels to mobility regimes very intensely, I think, is this idea that the zones of precarity within the global South are somewhat homogeneous, right? So the program we implement in Complexo do Alemão in Rio can be similar to a program we implement in Johannesburg, that can be similar to a program we implement in Dhaka, and so on and so forth. I mean, that there are some characteristics about precarity in developing and underdeveloping countries that are somewhat universal and that can inform our political responses to problems. And when you talk to groups in these different areas, you realize there is not much similarity, right, in what you see at Cité du Soleil in Port-au-Prince and what you see in Complexo do Alemão in Rio, right? That when Haitians have to travel from those places, what they face is very different, right? So one of the things that the Congolese and Angolans, for example, in slum areas in Rio would say is that, I only realized I was Black when I arrived here, because being Black was not a characteristic that would define me where I came from. And it creates a lot of insecurity for me in this new scenario. The absence of knowledge about Angola, the Democratic Republic of Congo, of African history, people would ask them. I mean, there are several documentaries now about, Congolese and Angolan migrants and refugees in Brazil. And one of the most common responses is precisely that. People keep asking us if there are monkeys where we came from. I mean, this perception that Africa in general, right, that there is no difference between Angola and Congo and Nigeria and South Africa, that this is a homogeneous continent. So what I'm trying to say is that there is a tendency, I think, to create homogeneous understandings of spaces, of peoples. And this has to do, again, with the statist, I think, modern conception of what political life is and political subjects are. So in a way, I think that the idea of traveling through different precarities, different levels, different meanings of precarity is precisely what constitutes some of the biggest challenges for mobile peoples. And I mean, I would say in the global South, but I think it's increasingly true. It's really a global phenomenon, right? If you look at big cities in the global North, of course, the levels and the issues of precarity, the discriminations are different. And again, everything is very heterogeneous. And that's why we need empirical research to understand and shed light towards those differences. But what I think we've seen in the 21st century is precisely the fact that those trends have become increasingly global, right? Those zones of precarity have become increasingly globally connected. And this has to do with the fact that the architecture for managing, producing, and containing precarious lives is also increasingly transnationally, internationally articulated, right? And this applies, obviously, for mobile groups. And when I'm talking about mobile groups, I'm focusing on, I would say, precarious, vulnerable mobile groups, right? Asylum seekers, refugees, low-skilled migrants. I mean, whatever definition we want to throw within this big umbrella of precarity and mobility. But this is an increasingly global, I think, architecture, right? of governance that is creating homogeneous responses for managing, controlling, and criminalizing and protecting, right? And reducing what we understand as protecting. Because I think this is also one of the consequences to respond the protection, I think, dilemma. Looking from my standpoint now, from the empirical research we're doing now with the Venezuelans in South America, one of the trends we're seeing is that protection is increasingly seen as regularization, right? When we thought initially that protection was, providing for impartial emergency assistance, but also, creating the conditions of enacting, promoting basic rights, of integrating into the community, and so on and so forth. Now protection is increasingly about how do we make normal, gente. Então deixa eu retomar aqui, depois vocês editam aí. So what we're seeing from our recent empirical research with Venezuelans in South America is this trend to a very minimum definition and very, I would say, even administrative understanding of what protection is, that is connected to two, I think, issues. One is to documenting people, letting them stay, regularizing. So this is emptying the refugee category, right? Asylum, from a more encompassing protective umbrella to a very narrow understanding of what those institutions, of what being legally allowed within a national territory means. So this is one thing. Regularization, protection becomes regularization, reduced to regularization in a way. And the second trend is that when we thought protection, I mean, back in the 90s, right? Early 90s, we thought protection as this all-encompassing category that now has been reduced to an economic kind of variable, right? People are integrated, people are protected if they can be self-sufficient, materially self-sufficient. And instead of talking about, decent labor, cultural translation, all those sorts of things that have been central to debates about integration, now we're talking about entrepreneurship and professionalization and capacity training and all the vocabulary is now driven to that sort of framework in which protection is understood as having a document, being allowed within a territory, and being materially self-sufficient, which is a very, very narrow understanding, right, of what people require to live a meaningful life, right? Because in a nutshell, this is what drives us, right? As human beings in the world. I mean, what's the meaning of life? And I think this is an increasingly global trend, right? We see that in developed economies, but we see that increasingly also in societies that were usually more community-driven. And this is certainly something that has been structuring our response to those groups in recent years.
Yeah, thank you so much, Carolina. I think that's very interesting, and I remembered even there are some works now. I think even Marcia Espinosa, she also writes about this, how like these new resettlement policies are taking into consideration these other types of, like, if people are able to be economically self-sufficient in destination societies, which is something that was not present before in this type of policies, like for resettlement. And I'm thinking now, it probably, I'm not sure if that's a topic of your work, but I'm because you said that you were working increasingly with Venezuelans in Brazil. And one thing that has always called my attention in the case of the Venezuelan flow towards the northern part of Brazil is this mixture of like populations. So to start out, you have non-indigenous and indigenous populations, and I know that has created a lot of challenges in terms of how Brazil is dealing with integration. So I'm not sure if you have come across any of that, and like you were saying about how integration is increasingly thought as something that is homogeneous and can be applied to whatever groups in the same way across the world. So I was thinking how that relates specifically to this case of indigenous populations who are mobile.
Yeah, I can recommend colleagues who have done extensive work on indigenous groups. I think it's a very interesting question in the sense that you're right. If we look at the Brazilian response to the Venezuelan flow, the indigenous Venezuelans, especially the ones from the Warao groups, they haven't been allowed to participate in several of the policies that have been implemented and in part, they have been prevented from being, for example, interiorized, right? Because the Brazilian policy now is to send the Venezuelan migrants and asylum seekers from the border to different municipalities throughout the country. The indigenous groups have not, right? They have been circumvented specifically in shelters that are, in a way, exclusive for groups from an indigenous background. And I think it has to do, I mean, I'm not an indigenous expert, scholar, but it has to do with a specific, I think, difficulty in terms of the legislation, right, regarding indigenous groups. It has to do with transnational ties as well between indigenous communities. So we do know that some of those indigenous groups, they circulate within national borders. And this is precisely one of the things that was a major issue of debate within Brazil, because we had a new legislation, a new law on migration back in 2017. And there was the possibility of specifically looking and protecting groups indigenous groups that lived in context of transborder movement. And this has been one of the topics that has been regulated later on by the government and vetoed by the then president of the country, in order to prevent, that specific level of protection. So again, I think the important point is that, mobility, migration is one of the layers through which we read the difficulties and the heterogeneity of those experiences, right? In relation to Venezuelans, I think we see, for example, it's not just the indigenous, but it's also different social economic backgrounds. Everyone is bundled up in those categories of temporary resident or asylum seeker or / refugee. But you do have groups, you have civil public employees who have a very good educational background, and then you have large families led by women who are incredibly vulnerable when they arrive here. You have the gender issue as well, with an increasing number of LGBT groups that are also part of that flow, that require specific responses, right, in relation to public policies. So it's a very complex, I think, mix of people. And you have this structured general policy that conflates indigenous groups in one bag, that conflates, you know, LGBT populations in another, families in another, singles in another. And when you get to the cities, you see that those policies don't travel very well.
Yeah, even in the shelters, right? In Brazil, they are divided by groups. So you have, yeah, it's pretty crazy. And
Well, shelter is a disputed category. It's the one that the government uses, but
yeah,
it basically, those are basically refugee camps.
refugee camps. Exactly. Yeah, and managed by the army. And
But we
Carolina,
learned that from the Europeans, right? I mean, that's part of our argument here is that, you know, the globalization of those processes has to do with the globalization of structures of management. And the hotspot approach, you know, the logistical approach that is increasingly operational and I would say mainstreamed, right, in developed countries in regards to managing mobility is traveling fast to other global places. And we're learning it fast.
exactly. And we are often, Brazil is often praised, right, for like having a very good system of reception, which is becoming increasingly militarized and yeah.
I mean, there are points in which you should recognize, right? In the sense that we do have a large number of refugees who have been recognized prima facie in Brazil. You do have a process of improving, right? Speeding up the response. You do have a larger number of groups involved in debating and constructing. I mean, we have a new legislation that, despite all the problems, is an advance in relation to the framework. So, I mean, we do have points that I think are positive if we look at the past, 40 years of this discussion in migration and refugee politics in Brazil. But that should not prevent us from understanding how those mechanisms are adapted to policies of criminalization, militarization, of reproduction of violences, of silencing those groups, of increasingly global coordination that makes those processes highly invisible to civil society groups, to refugee and migrants organizations, which makes accountability increasingly difficult as well, to the political economy of those processes, who is funding, where the money goes, and how it's very non-transparent, right? There is a lot of money flowing to mobility regimes, and we don't know where that money goes. I mean, we have some hints, but we know it's not ending necessarily in the hands of those who need it most, right? So there are many issues that should be the focus of our research and our critique, without necessarily pointing towards the gains. I'm not saying those are gains that the government enacted. On the contrary, it's the result of a lot of political engagement from refugee and migrants groups themselves. But those are gains nonetheless, right? We do have a better legal infrastructure now, including to fight strategically for those communities' rights.
Yeah, even compared to other contexts in South America, I think we have certainly gained a lot from the new legislation and all the struggles from the migrant-led groups and this global political society. I don't know if I'm using the term right. And Carolina, just to finalize our discussion, one thing that we liked a lot in your work is how and has a lot to do with this concept of mobility between zones of marginality, is this idea of the transnational third world, as conceptualized by Boaventura de Souza Santos. So if you could tell us a bit more about that.
Well, as you said, this is not a concept I developed. I appropriated it to understand how those spaces of transnational mobile precarity operate, right? So I think Boaventura is one of the scholars that has been very influential in Brazil in relation to thinking through, the possibilities of and limits of citizenship in context of globalization, of global financial capitalism. And I think this is a scholar that has been central to discussions in Portuguese, I think, mostly in Portuguese written research. Boaventura has been an interesting author to read and follow. But the idea of transnational third worlds strike me as an interesting way of, on one hand, escaping methodological nationalism. I mean, the idea of third world still, I think, draws my attention to issues of inequality, injustice, and violence in ways that talking about developing and underdeveloped countries does not, right? It rings, it has a symbolic, I think, capacity to draw attention to how structuring the world is profoundly unequal, right? Geographically, culturally, materially, and so on and so forth. So I'm one of the scholars who believe that third world is a concept that's still relevant today, right? So that's one point I think the idea of transnational third worlds evokes. And I think third worldism is something that's, I don't know why, but it's missing from the discussion on mobility in many ways. There isn't much, I think. There is increasingly debate, right, about the post-colonial, decolonial turn within migration studies, but the idea of third worldism is somewhat missing from current debates. It does appear with authors that emphasize gender, race, but as that liminal category, that I think can help us structure and understand some of the structural issues that are part of mobility regimes nowadays. So this is one thing. And the other is the idea of transnationalism, right? But not transnationally in terms of transnationality, in terms of, circumventing state borders or thinking about networks that somehow operate outside of those boundaries, but thinking about how those structures of inequality, injustice, but also the legal, normative, the grammar through which we think and respond to mobile peoples is increasingly organized transnationally. Rather than globally, right? So one of the things, for example, from our research was we tried to map who are the actors who are assisting, implementing the policy in the northern border of Brazil with Venezuelans. And there were over 80 different agencies. And this includes, the social assistance secretary from, the city, the municipality, through the International Migration Organization, through, a very strange confessional organization that was based on a messianic sort of a guy who created this organization and is now, managing one of the shelters. I don't think they're managing it by now, but I mean, they started managing for 2 years one of the shelters, right? So this very strange mix of non-governmental, governmental, international organizations that are all on the ground, and they have to coordinate their efforts. And this is, I mean, can you think of a more transnational environment than that? Right, in a distant border in South America that takes you 5-6 hours to arrive. So I think that the idea of transnational third worlds helps us understand spaces like that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I don't know if Manuela has another question.
I have many questions, but I think we'll have to leave it there because of time. Thank you so much, Carolina. This was just fantastic and amazing. And I'm just taking notes here of what you're saying. And yeah, it was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Manuela, Nuni. It was a lovely conversation. I hope I was clear enough, and I hope we can engage later on that agenda, because I know your own research is very relevant and interesting to many of the themes that have driven my scholar advocacy career as well.
Thank you so much, Carolina. Certainly, you have been more than clear, and I think your work is very inspirational to us. So thank you so much, and yeah, thank you for everyone who's watching us as well. So.